Hello again. For this video, I want to talk about coming up with a thesis for our essays. This is one of the most important parts of kind of getting started with your essay and planning out your essay. And it's also one that we've probably gotten a lot of sort of confusing or maybe just bad information about. So, the thesis. First thing, I'll always just say thesis instead of thesis statement. Because I think one thing that we've heard about a thesis is that it has to be just one sentence, and I don't really agree with this. I think that yeah, you might have been told before that the thesis had to be the last sentence of the first paragraph. I think for college essays that are going to be maybe a little more complicated than what you've written, definitely like in high school, it's okay to have like a few sentences be your thesis. Because all your thesis really is your argument. It's your main idea. It's the takeaway. For our narrative essay, it's going to be the message about language, right? That's the thesis. For coming to awareness of language, the essay we talked about last week, the thesis there was the thing about language making you feel more free or liberating or whatever he was saying. Um, So it's either going to be the argument if you're doing like a persuasive kind of essay where you're supposed to convince the reader, or it's going to be like the takeaway or the lesson for the audience in other kinds of essays. So some other things you might have heard about the thesis. The way I remember doing it, like in high school, and this all kind of went along with writing a 5 paragraph essay, was that they would have you have the thesis where you list like the 3 things. They would give you like one of those bullshit topics where you have to write an essay about like if your school should start using school uniforms, and you'll have a thesis that's like, I think we should wear school uniforms because it would be less distracting and people could save money on clothes and whatever third thing. Where that kind of structure where you'd have like, you'd have the 3 body paragraphs and each one of them would have the one main point, and then you'd put that in the thesis. So I think this for this reason and this reason and this reason. I don't think that kind of structure is really going to help us too much for college essays, because we're not going to be writing 5 paragraph essays. That whole format is just it's not how people really write. It's just not how academics or professional writers write stuff. And if you have to write something that's longer than a couple of pages, you're going to need more than 5 paragraphs. So don't worry about having like listing the 3 things in your thesis. Don't worry about it being just one sentence. We do probably want it at the beginning of the essay. For our essays, since our essays are going to be, like 3 pages, 4 pages, you probably do want it in the first paragraph, but the way I would say it is, by the end of the first paragraph, you want the reader to know what the argument is. You want the reader to know what you're going to be convincing them of, or like what message you're going to be sending, or whatever the main idea is. You want them to know by the end of the first paragraph. But again, it doesn't just have to be one sentence. It doesn't have to be the last sentence. However you think it works. Okay. Another point, so now I'm looking back at the reading that I had given you formulating a thesis, and I think that reading has a lot of good advice and like good kind of bullet points and questions to think about when it comes to thesis. One thing that it mentions is, if you're thinking about your thesis as a question, you want to answer that question, and that should be your thesis. So like with the narrative essay where we're supposed to have the thesis is like the message about language or whatever, right? If you were thinking about, if you were like, well, okay, my essay, what's my thesis? My thesis is, why is language important? The thesis is going to be the answer to that question, right? So the answer to that question might be, it's important because it gets, language gets used to try to control us through authority, like we talked about the talking back, or people get treated unfairly because of language, like the Virchon Young thing, or language connects us to our culture, like with the essay Mother Tongue. And that is going to be your thesis. So if you're thinking about your thesis as a question, always answer the question, and that's going to be what your thesis really is. Another point that they make towards the bottom of that reading is they talk about the issue of a thesis being too general or too specific. And I think this is something that can really trip people up, especially when you start writing more complicated papers. And the thing with this is, like, it might seem like it's easy to have a thesis that's very general, because there would be a lot of things that you could then talk about and touch on to make sure that you get as many pages as you need. But if you make your thesis too general, too expansive, there's just going to be too much that you'd have to get to. Like, it can get to a point where you would have to write 30 pages to fully make your point, or 100 pages, or a whole book if you're really going to prove the point. Like the example that they give in the reading, in the formulating a thesis reading I posted, what was it? I think last week. They give an example where they give a thesis that says malls have ruined the fabric of American life, and they say that that one's too general. Why? Because to say that malls have ruined the fabric of American life, well, the fabric of American life is such a general category that it's going to include, like environmental problems and traffic patterns and zoning laws and whatever. You'd have to talk about too many different things and it would just be too much to deal with in 4 pages or however long like your average college essay is. So if it's too general, it might seem good because you're like, oh, I'll talk about this and I'll talk about that and then I'll have a thing about this. But what ends up happening is you can't really do all of it justice. You can't fully explain all of it in the few amount of pages that we have here. Even though it seems like a lot, 4 pages might seem like a huge amount, but it actually isn't. So something like the malls have ruined the fabric of American life. That would need like a whole book to actually fully explain everything, or else you end up cutting corners, and it's not like totally satisfying. The other problem can be if your thesis is too specific. If it's too narrow, it doesn't really give you any room to go. The example that they give in that reading, it says the big city mall should not have been built because it reduced existing sales at existing big city stores by 21%. So that just kind of gives you everything. It gives you like the conclusion and the reason and the statistic all in there, and there's really nothing else to say. So that can be a problem with a thesis too. Is if it's too specific, it doesn't leave you any room to expand, and then you get to the problem where you can't write enough pages about it. So it's kind of like a Goldilocks thing where you need the thesis that's not too specific and not too general, but like it's just right for the amount that you have to write. And sometimes this is hard to realize until you start writing. Like you'll start off with a thesis and then you'll start writing about it and you'll be like, whoa, if I was really gonna like deal with everything I would have to deal with here, this would be a really long paper and I don't want to write that much. And then you can kind of go back and you can tweak the thesis and change it a little bit and then you can work it out. But I think sometimes, if you're experiencing writer's block or you can't write a paper that's long enough, you might want to look back at your thesis and be like, okay, is this really what I'm trying to argue? Is this exactly how I want to say it? Do I need to include some more things in the thesis? Do I need to take some things out of the thesis? You just want to make sure that it's not too general, not too specific. So yeah, it's our argument. It's the main thing we want the reader to get out of our essay. That's what we have going on with the thesis. This is important and it's tough, so we'll keep talking about it, but that's all for now.